My sister Vanessa truly believed she had orchestrated the perfect Thanksgiving ambush to steal my only inheritance. She thought she was cornering a broke, desperate freelancer who would just fold under family pressure. She had no idea that I had just finalized a $57 million acquisition of my tech company, or that I had spent the last month quietly buying up every single debt her husband owed. My name is Kira. I am 35 years old, and this is the story of how a plate of dry turkey and a mountain of disrespect pushed me to dismantle my toxic family in less than an hour. Before I dive into the details of that explosive night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had to smile through the pain of family members who severely underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta, image was everything to my parents. Our sprawling brick home in Buckhead was designed to impress outsiders. It was a pristine fortress of manicured lawns and towering oak trees. Inside, the emotional climate was always cold, but on holidays my mother Brenda spared no expense to put on a theatrical display of domestic perfection. This Thanksgiving was no different. The massive mahogany dining table was suffocating under the weight of crystal goblets, gold-rimmed porcelain plates, and towering floral centerpieces. The aroma of baked macaroni and cheese, slow-cooked collard greens, and a perfectly glazed turkey filled the room, but the air felt impossibly heavy. There was a thick, unspoken tension vibrating through the dining room. It was the kind of heavy silence that always precedes one of my family-coordinated attacks. I sat quietly at my designated spot near the kitchen door, smoothing the napkin in my lap and controlling my breathing. That was the same seat I had occupied since childhood, safely tucked out of the way so the spotlight could remain firmly on my sister. For the past decade, my family had openly treated me like an embarrassing charity case. While my sister Vanessa was celebrated as the golden child for marrying a flashy investment banker and living in a gated community, I was the resident disappointment. My parents constantly belittled my career loudly, complaining to their country club friends that I was just a struggling web designer who could not get a real corporate job. They had completely convinced themselves that I spent my days building cheap websites in my pajamas, barely scraping together enough money to pay my utility bills. I never corrected them. I learned early on that sharing my ambitions with my family only gave them ammunition to tear me down. So I stayed silent. I kept my head down and worked 100-hour weeks for 8 years, building a highly specialized data analytics firm from scratch. Just 3 days before this Thanksgiving dinner, I had sat in a sleek downtown law office and signed the final paperwork. A global tech conglomerate had acquired my firm for $57 million in cash. I was a multi-millionaire sitting in silence listening to my mother passive-aggressively ask if I needed her to pack up leftovers so I could afford to eat for the rest of the week. The true reason for the heavy tension became clear before my father Warren could even pick up the carving knife. Vanessa sat across from me with her flawless makeup masking a frantic, nervous energy. Next to her sat her husband Julian, wearing a custom-tailored suit that I happened to know was bought on credit. Julian was swirling a glass of expensive bourbon and leaning back in his chair with a smug, practiced smile of fake sympathy that made my stomach turn. Without a word of preamble, Vanessa reached into her designer tote bag. She did not ask about my day. She did not offer a holiday greeting. Instead, she pulled out a thick manila envelope and slid it aggressively across the pristine white tablecloth. It stopped directly on top of my empty dinner plate. I looked down at the bold legal print visible through the flap. It was a property transfer deed. Vanessa cleared her throat and squared her shoulders as she looked down her nose at me. She announced to the entire table that she needed me to vacate our late-grandmother house by the end of the month. She spoke in a clipped, demanding tone, as if she were giving orders to an incompetent employee. Grandma Josephine House was a modest 2-bedroom bungalow in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. It was not a mansion, but it was the only place in the world where I had ever felt truly safe and unconditionally loved. When Grandma passed away 3 years ago, she specifically left the house to me, bypassing my parents and my sister entirely. She knew exactly how greedy Vanessa was, and wanted to ensure I always had a roof over my head. I had spent the last 3 years lovingly restoring the hardwood floors, tending to her rose bushes, and finding peace within those walls. Now Vanessa was casually demanding that I hand over the only sanctuary I had ever known. Vanessa took a sip of her sparkling water, entirely unbothered by the sheer audacity of her demand. She declared loudly that it was time for me to stop being so selfish and make a real sacrifice for the family. She explained that Julian had a massive, groundbreaking new venture for his investment fund, and he urgently needed the bungalow to use as collateral for a commercial bridge loan. Julian nodded solemnly, adjusting his expensive watch, acting as though he were doing the world a favor by taking my home. He looked at me with an infuriating expression of manufactured pity. He told me that real estate finance was far too complicated for a freelancer like me to understand. But he assured me that leveraging my house was the only way to secure his family future. The absolute nerve of this man sitting at my parents' table, demanding the deed to my home while sipping liquor he could not afford to buy, was almost comical. My parents did not gasp in shock. They did not defend me. In fact, my mother Brenda leaned forward and immediately nodded in agreement, her diamond earrings catching the light from the chandelier. My father Warren crossed his arms and stared at me expectantly, waiting for my compliance. The ambush had clearly been planned well in advance. They had all discussed this behind my back, agreeing that my stability was a perfectly acceptable sacrifice to maintain the illusion of Vanessa wealth. The room fell perfectly silent, waiting for me to break down, waiting for me to surrender. They expected the old Kira to cry, to argue, and eventually fold under the overwhelming weight of their collective disappointment. They did not know that the woman sitting at the table no longer needed their approval. I let the manila envelope sit on my plate untouched, as the warmth of my secret wealth wrapped around me like an invisible armor. Vanessa leaned forward when she realized I was not going to open the envelope. She tapped her manicured nails against her water glass, creating a sharp ringing sound that demanded everyone's attention. She sighed dramatically, as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. She told me I needed to sign the paperwork by tomorrow morning. She did not ask. She commanded. She explained with a terrifying level of entitlement that Julian Firm was on the verge of acquiring a massive commercial real estate portfolio in Midtown. According to her, Julian was a financial genius who was currently orchestrating a deal that would secure the family legacy for generations. The only minor hurdle, she claimed, was a temporary lack of liquid capital for a bridge loan. That was where my house came in. She said the bungalow was just sitting there gathering dust and hoarding equity while I wasted my life pretending to be a business owner. She actually used the word pretending. She insisted it was deeply selfish of me to hoard a valuable asset when Julian could use the collateral to multiply the family wealth. I stared at her, letting her words hang in the heavy air of the dining room. She wanted me to give up the home our grandmother specifically left to me so her white husband could use it to fund his corporate gambling. Julian finally decided to join the conversation. He shifted in his antique dining chair, crossing one leg over the other so his designer socks were perfectly visible. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip before offering me a painfully condescending smile. He told me he understood this might seem overwhelming to someone without a background in high-level finance. He actually used his free hand to make a calming gesture as if I were hysterical. He promised me that the deed transfer was simply a bureaucratic formality. He claimed he would have the property released back to me within 6 months, once his new venture generated its first round of massive dividends. Julian spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who was entirely used to failing upwards. He threw around terms like equity leverage and mezzanine financing, hoping to dazzle me into submission. He assumed I was financially illiterate. He assumed my freelance career meant I barely understood how a checking account worked. He painted a picture of himself as a benevolent savior who was graciously allowing me to participate in his brilliant financial ecosystem. He even had the audacity to suggest that by sacrificing my home, I was finally contributing something meaningful to the family name. The sheer arrogance radiating from his side of the table was suffocating. He was a man drowning in his own financial incompetence, trying to steal a life raft from the sister-in-law he openly despised. Vanessa eagerly picked up right where Julian left off. She painted a vivid picture of how unnecessary the house was for my lifestyle. She reminded the table that I was single, had no children, and worked from a laptop all day. She suggested with an entirely straight face that I should just move into a small studio apartment near the airport. She promised it would be much easier for me to maintain, and I would not have to worry about cleaning gutters or mowing the lawn. She framed the theft of my inheritance as a favor to relieve me of the burden of homeownership. She smiled brightly as she delivered this devastating insult, her perfectly white teeth gleaming under the chandelier. She truly believed she was untouchable. She believed that because she drove a luxury sport utility vehicle and lived in a house paid for by other people, she possessed the ultimate authority over my life. The smell of the roasted turkey and the sweet potato casserole was beginning to make me nauseous. The contrast between the beautiful holiday spread and the ugly reality of their greed was jarring. I looked from Vanessa to Julian. They sat shoulder to shoulder, a united front of deceit and entitlement. They had clearly rehearsed this exact conversation for weeks. They probably sat in their overpriced kitchen, drinking expensive wine, laughing about how easy it would be to bully me into handing over the deed. They were so confident in their plan that they brought the paperwork to Thanksgiving dinner, expecting me to sign away my future before the pumpkin pie was even served. They thought the pressure of the holiday and the presence of my parents would force me into immediate compliance. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and lowered his voice into a fake, reassuring register. He told me I needed to think of the bigger picture. He said family was about teamwork, and right now the team needed my equity to secure a win. He promised he would make it up to me, maybe even buy me a nice watch once his deal closed. He treated me like a naive child who could be bought off with a shiny trinket while he stole the roof over my head. I kept my face perfectly still, revealing absolutely none of the joy I felt, knowing I held his literal financial destruction in my purse. I let him talk. I let him dig his grave deeper with every arrogant word. I watched him swirl his bourbon, completely unaware that the glass he was holding, the suit he was wearing, and the car he drove here in were all legally owned by the woman he was currently trying to swindle. I listened carefully to the specific phrasing Julian used to describe his investment fund. He mentioned Tier 2 assets and rapid liquidity protocols. To an untrained ear, he sounded like a Wall Street prodigy. But I was not an untrained ear. I had spent the last decade building a tech company that analyzed complex financial data for global banking institutions. I knew the architecture of corporate debt better than I knew my own reflection. The buzzwords Julian was casually tossing across the cranberry sauce were massive red flags. Those specific terms were almost exclusively used by fund managers trying to mask catastrophic losses and failing portfolios. He was not expanding his business. He was desperately trying to stop it from collapsing entirely. He needed the clean, unencumbered equity of Grandma Josephine House to plug a gaping hole in his sinking ship. Vanessa reached across the table and placed her hand over Julian's hand, playing the role of the adoring, supportive wife. She looked at me with eyes completely devoid of genuine warmth. She told me I should be grateful Julian was willing to handle all the legal fees for the deed transfer. She acted as though paying the notary fee to steal my house was an act of profound charity. She went on to describe the new interior design plans she had for her own home, mentioning custom Italian marble countertops and imported silk curtains. She was deliberately flaunting her wealth, attempting to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. She wanted me to feel so small and so insignificant that giving up my house would feel like a natural submission to my betters. She wanted me to believe that my only purpose was to serve as a stepping stone for her continued elevation. I slowly reached out and finally touched the manila envelope. I did not open it. I simply rested my fingertips on the smooth paper. Julian smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, believing he had won. He reached into his tailored jacket and produced an engraved silver pen, placing it on the table between us. The sheer presumptuousness of the gesture was breathtaking. He expected me to sign the quitclaim deed right there next to the gravy boat without reading a single page. I looked down at the silver pen and then back up at my sister. The satisfaction radiating from her face was absolute. She had spent her entire life taking things from me. My parents' attention, my childhood toys, my peace of mind. Taking my home was just the final logical step in her mind. She thought this was the end of the conversation. She had absolutely no idea it was just the beginning. Before the silver pen could even settle completely on the tablecloth, my father Warren cleared his throat. It was a sharp, commanding sound. He possessed a deep, resonant voice that he had spent decades perfecting as a mid-level executive at a regional logistics firm. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and fixed me with a stern, disapproving glare. He told me to pick up the pen and stop making everything so difficult. He did not ask for my thoughts on giving away my home. He simply expected me to obey, as if I were a rebellious teenager breaking curfew instead of a 35-year-old woman being robbed. He stated that family members made sacrifices for one another, and it was incredibly selfish of me to sit on an empty house when my sister needed my support. The word selfish echoed in my mind. It was their favorite weapon against me. Whenever Vanessa needed something and I hesitated, I was labeled selfish. I looked at my father and remembered the summer I turned 19. I had worked double shifts at a diner to save up for my first reliable used car. A week before I was supposed to buy it, Vanessa carelessly crashed her own convertible into a retaining wall because she was texting while driving. My father had marched into my bedroom and demanded I hand over my entire savings to cover the insurance deductible for Vanessa so her premium would not go up. When I cried and begged him to let me keep the money I had earned, he called me selfish. He told me a good sister would never let her sibling suffer financial hardship. The script had not changed in 16 years. The only difference was that the price tag had gone from a $3,000 deductible to a $500,000 piece of real estate. My mother Brenda saw the brief flash of memory in my eyes and immediately swooped in to reinforce the attack. She set down her crystal wine glass and folded her hands neatly over her plate. She spoke in that sickeningly sweet tone she always used when she was delivering a lethal insult. She told me I needed to look at the situation logically. She pointed out that I was 35 years old and completely unattached. She weaponized my single status in front of the entire table, stating that since I had no husband to consider and no children to provide for, I did not need a whole house to myself. She gestured toward Vanessa and Julian, emphasizing that they were building a real family and a real legacy. She made it explicitly clear that in her eyes my life held no intrinsic value unless it was being used to subsidize my sister. I kept my hands resting gently in my lap, making sure my breathing remained slow and steady. If I raised my voice, they would call me emotional. If I defended myself, they would call me defensive. I knew exactly how to play this game, so I let Brenda keep talking. I let her dig the trench deeper. She sighed heavily, acting as though my very existence was a burden she was graciously tolerating. She looked at me with an expression of profound pity and delivered the ultimate insult. She said it was time for me to grow up and accept that my cute little computer hobby was never going to pay off. The phrase cute little computer hobby hung in the air. Julian let out a short, amused chuckle, and Vanessa smirked behind her water glass. My mother was referring to the data analytics firm I had built with my own bare hands. She was dismissing the countless sleepless nights, the canceled vacations, the brutal client pitches, and the relentless grind of building a specialized software architecture from the ground up. In her mind, because I did not wear a designer suit to an office building every day, I was just playing on the internet. She told me I needed to stop pretending I was a business owner and face reality. She suggested that after Julian secured his loan, he might even be able to find me an entry-level administrative position at his firm. She presented this as a generous act of charity, offering me a chance to finally do something productive with my life under the guidance of my brilliant brother-in-law. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. My mother was begging me to become a receptionist for a man who was secretly drowning in $3 million of toxic debt. She was mocking my career just 3 days after a global tech conglomerate had thoroughly vetted my company code, my client list, and my revenue projections, and decided it was worth $57 million in pure liquid cash. She was demanding I give up my home to save a man whose financial survival currently depended entirely on my mercy. Warren nodded firmly in agreement with the assessment Brenda made of my life. He tapped his index finger against the table, pointing directly at the quitclaim deed. He told me that Julian had gone out of his way to handle all the complicated legal paperwork to make this easy for me. He instructed me to sign the document immediately so we could move past this unpleasantness and enjoy our Thanksgiving meal as a united family. He actually tried to frame the theft of my property as an act of family unity. He warned me that if I ruined the holiday by being stubborn, I would not be welcome back for Christmas. They were threatening me with exile, as if losing access to their constant belittling was a punishment rather than a profound relief. I looked at the four faces staring back at me: Vanessa triumphant and greedy, Julian arrogant and desperate, Warren authoritative and blind, Brenda cruel and dismissive. They had boxed me in, completely convinced that they had covered every angle and neutralized every potential defense I might have. They were so busy looking down on me that they completely failed to notice I had already won the war. I did not reach for the silver pen. I did not cry. I did not apologize. Instead, I slowly pulled my chair out and adjusted my posture, sitting up perfectly straight. It was finally time to break my silence. I reached across the table and picked up my heavy linen napkin. I folded it perfectly in half and placed it on the table beside the manila envelope. I then picked up the crystal water pitcher and poured myself a glass. The sound of the ice clinking against the glass was the only noise in the dining room. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for the inevitable surrender they had grown so accustomed to witnessing. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, placed the glass down, and looked directly at Vanessa. I told her no. I kept my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. I said I will not be signing the deed today, and I will not be moving out of our grandmother house at the end of the month or any month after that. The house belongs to me and it is going to stay with me. For a full 10 seconds, nobody breathed. The refusal was so simple and so absolute that it completely derailed their carefully orchestrated ambush. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting to our mother for backup. Warren darkened his face into a deep scowl. He slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, making the silverware rattle. He demanded to know what I had just said, as if he possessed the authority to make me rewind time and change my answer. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest, and immediately accused me of deliberately trying to ruin Thanksgiving. The manufactured outrage was almost comical, but I did not smile. I simply sat there, completely anchored in my own power, letting their anger wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. This was the exact moment Julian decided to step in and take control of the situation. He pushed his heavy wooden chair back slightly and unbuttoned his suit jacket, projecting an image of relaxed authority. He gave a long, patronizing sigh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a deeply confused child who could not grasp basic instructions. He held his hands up in a placating gesture, asking Warren and Brenda to calm down. He told them he would handle this. He turned his attention back to me, wearing that same insufferable smirk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and locked his eyes onto mine. He told me he understood that finance was intimidating, especially for someone who had never really operated in the corporate world. Julian launched into a painfully slow explanation of real estate equity, operating under the massive delusion that I lacked the intellect to understand his business. He spoke with the cadence of a preschool teacher explaining colors. He told me that leaving a house completely paid off and sitting unencumbered was a terrible financial decision. He called it dead capital. He explained that smart money was always moving and that by refusing to leverage the property, I was essentially losing money every single day. He drew invisible graphs in the air with his silver pen, trying to illustrate how his investment fund would take the stagnant equity from my house and multiply it tenfold through high-yield commercial acquisitions. He assured me that his portfolio was completely insulated from market volatility and that giving him my house was the safest investment I could ever make. I watched his mouth move, noting every single lie that slipped past his teeth. He talked about corporate finance and asset mobilization with absolute arrogance. He assumed my silence was born of confusion rather than calculation. He explained that a bridge loan was just a temporary instrument used by high net worth individuals to cross short-term liquidity gaps. He promised that the bank would barely even register my name on the paperwork. He told me I should view this not as losing a house, but as gaining a front row seat to a masterclass in wealth generation. He actually suggested I should be taking notes. The sheer, unadulterated confidence he possessed while sitting across from the woman who owned his entire financial existence was a profound psychological study in arrogance. Julian did not stop there. When his financial lecture failed to elicit a response from me, he smoothly transitioned into subtle intimidation. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of serious concern. He told me that the business world was ruthless, and that someone with my limited professional experience would easily be crushed under the weight of property taxes and maintenance costs. He implied that I was incapable of managing the asset on my own, and that I would eventually lose the house to the city anyway. He told me that by handing the deed over to him, I was securing the protection of a seasoned financial expert. He framed his attempted theft as a rescue mission. He warned me that if I allowed my stubborn pride to ruin this deal, the financial fallout for his family would be entirely my fault. He wanted me to carry the guilt of his impending bankruptcy. He tapped the silver pen against the table twice and pushed it closer to my hand. He told me to just sign the paper so we could all enjoy the wonderful meal my mother had prepared. He promised everything would make sense once the money started rolling in. He sat back, crossing his arms over his chest, radiating an unearned sense of victory. He truly believed his barrage of financial jargon and subtle threats had overwhelmed me. He believed he had successfully boxed me into a corner where my only option was to submit to his superior intellect. What Julian failed to realize was that his arrogance had just handed me the perfect weapon. Every buzzword he used and every exaggerated claim he made about his fund was another nail in his coffin. He was trying to intimidate a data analytics expert with imaginary numbers. I knew his portfolio was not insulated. I knew his liquidity gap was actually a massive crater of defaulted loans. I knew he was days away from total ruin. By trying to play the brilliant financier, he had set the perfect stage for his own spectacular downfall. I did not interrupt him. I let him build his glorious house of cards as high as he possibly could right there in the middle of my parents' dining room. I let him feel the absolute rush of supreme confidence. I knew that the higher he built his lie, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally decided to knock it down. I looked at the silver pen sitting next to the deed. I looked at the expectant face Julian wore and the greedy eyes of my sister. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, ready to snatch the envelope away the second my signature touched the paper. I placed both of my hands flat on the table. The calm radiating through my body was absolute. I was no longer the frightened little girl, desperate for family approval. I was the architect of their impending reality check. I looked directly at Julian and prepared to pull the first thread of his carefully constructed illusion. Vanessa saw the absolute calm in my eyes, and her fake smile finally shattered completely. She snatched her hand back from the table and let out a sharp, bitter laugh that sounded like breaking glass. If direct intimidation and complex financial jargon were not going to force my hand immediately, she decided to pivot to her favorite and most lethal weapon. She shifted to psychological warfare. She leaned back in her heavy wooden dining chair and aggressively smoothed the linen napkin on her lap. She looked across the table at our mother and loudly changed the subject entirely, ignoring my flat refusal to sign her paperwork. She announced that she and Julian were completely exhausted from their incredibly demanding high-net-worth lifestyle and desperately needed their upcoming winter vacation to decompress. She made sure her voice was exceptionally loud, ensuring the sound bounced off the dining room walls, so I would absorb every single word of her fabricated success story. Vanessa began detailing their lavish plans for a 2-week luxury ski trip to Aspen right after Christmas. She described the private 5-bedroom chalet they had supposedly rented right on the mountain, with ski-in and ski-out access. She talked about the personal chef they had hired to cook their meals, the private ski instructors for their private slopes, and the first-class flight tickets they had already secured. She turned her head and looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smirk. She said it was a real shame I could not join them, but she knew my strict freelance budget would never cover even a single night in that exclusive zip code. She suggested that maybe I could find a nice cheap cabin in the local state park to get some fresh air. My mother Brenda immediately chimed in, cooing over how wonderful the Aspen trip sounded and how much the golden couple deserved a lavish break after working so hard to build their empire. I sat perfectly still, taking a slow sip of my ice water, and let my mind do exactly what it did best. I analyzed the data. I knew the luxury real estate market in Aspen very intimately, because my data analytics firm had just run a massive predictive pricing model for a global hospitality conglomerate. Booking a premium 5-bedroom chalet right on the mountain for the peak week after Christmas required a confirmed reservation made at least 8 months in advance. It also required a non-refundable cash deposit of roughly $50,000. Yet Vanessa had just loudly claimed that Julian surprised her with the spontaneous booking last Tuesday afternoon. Furthermore, if Julian was currently suffering from a short-term liquidity gap so severe that he needed to steal his sister-in-law house to secure a bridge loan, by Friday morning he absolutely did not have $50,000 in liquid cash sitting around to drop on a vacation last week. The math was screaming at me. It was a complete fabrication designed solely to make me feel small and inferior. Before I could even fully process the absurdity of the ski trip, Live Vanessa moved seamlessly onto her next point of pride. She reached over and affectionately patted Julian on the shoulder, rubbing the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. She proudly announced to the entire table that Julian had just upgraded his daily driver to a brand new custom-ordered Porsche. She went on to describe the custom-stitched leather interior, the upgraded surround sound system, and the ridiculous monthly lease payment, as if lighting money on fire was a badge of supreme honor. Julian puffed out his chest, looking incredibly pleased with the attention. He humbly bragged that a man in his position needed to project absolute success to his high-net-worth clients. He claimed the exotic car was essentially a necessary business expense required to maintain his image as a top-tier fund manager in a competitive city. Once again, my analytical brain tore their beautiful story to shreds in a matter of seconds. I had spent the last month quietly purchasing the distressed debt portfolios from 3 major commercial lenders in the area. I knew exactly what the credit profile of Julian looked like. His primary investment fund was leveraged to the absolute breaking point, and his personal credit score was in a free fall. No reputable exotic car dealership on the planet would lease a custom Porsche to a man with a debt-to-income ratio that catastrophic unless he was paying a subprime interest rate of over 20%. The alternative was that he put down a massive cash deposit, which the Aspen lie already proved he did not have. The only logical conclusion was that the car was either leased under a fraudulent corporate shell company that was currently defaulting, or it was a short-term weekend rental he was passing off as a personal vehicle to maintain his facade for the holiday. They were drowning in a sea of high-interest debt just to pretend they were wealthy enough to sit at the country club table. My father Warren raised his glass of red wine and offered a booming toast to Julian and his incredible financial success. He told Julian that he was incredibly proud to have a son-in-law who knew how to provide for his family in such a spectacular and traditional fashion. Warren then looked pointedly at me, his eyes filled with heavy judgment and disappointment. He stated that it was important for people to surround themselves with high achievers so they could learn how the real world operated. He was explicitly telling me that I was a failure who needed to study Julian to understand how to be successful. Brenda agreed wholeheartedly, adding that she hoped I was paying close attention to how a real man took care of his household. They were aggressively feeding the monster, inflating the ego of Julian to dangerous levels. They were completely blind to the fact that his entire existence was built on quicksand and borrowed time. I looked at the beautiful roasted turkey sitting untouched in the center of the table. The wonderful smell of the holiday food was entirely overpowered by the stench of their financial desperation. Vanessa was glowing brightly, bathed in the toxic validation of our parents. She truly believed that by listing off her imaginary luxury purchases, she had successfully put me in my proper place. She thought that by painting this picture of extreme wealth, she would make me feel so incredibly inadequate that I would simply hand over the deed to the bungalow just to feel like I belonged to their elite circle. She wanted me to beg for their approval. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my supposed failure. But sitting there listening to their desperate lies, I did not feel small at all. I felt an overwhelming sense of pity. They were exhausting themselves running on a miserable hamster wheel of fake luxury, terrified that someone would discover the truth. They had absolutely no idea that the quiet woman sitting at the end of their table had already bought the wheel. Julian watched my face carefully as the silence stretched across the dining room. He saw my lack of emotional outburst and entirely misinterpreted it. He thought my quiet observation was the look of a defeated woman finally realizing she was outmatched. Realizing that Vanessa's harsh demands and his own financial lectures had not immediately produced a signature, he decided to switch tactics. He shifted in his chair, leaning back to project an aura of total relaxation and control. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, entirely smoothing his silk tie and adopting the soft, soothing tone of a benevolent benefactor. He was preparing to play the magnanimous savior descending from his corporate tower to rescue his poor, struggling sister-in-law from her own financial incompetence. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, but instead of pulling out another legal document, he produced a sleek, leather-bound checkbook. He placed it gently on the table right next to the silver pen. He clicked the pen open and looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured sympathy. He told me he understood that moving was a stressful and expensive endeavor, especially for someone operating on a precarious freelance income. He said he did not want to see family struggle, and he certainly did not want me to feel like I was being thrown out onto the street. He spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure my parents heard every single word of his incredible generosity. With grand sweeping strokes of his pen, Julian filled out a check. He tore it from the booklet with a crisp, satisfying sound and slid it across the white tablecloth until it rested right beside the manila envelope. I looked down at the bold handwriting. It was a personal check made out to me for $10,000. Julian smiled, a tight, controlled expression of absolute superiority. He announced that he was giving me this money out of his own pocket to help me get back on my feet. He suggested I use it to secure the first and last month rent on a nice, cozy studio apartment. He even had the audacity to recommend a specific neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, describing it as a vibrant, up-and-coming area perfect for an artistic type like me. He was essentially offering to pay me a tiny fraction of my own home value to banish me to a lower-income zip code so he would never have to look at me again. My mother, Brenda, gasped, pressing her hands to her chest as if she had just witnessed a holy miracle. She looked at Julian with pure adoration and then snapped her eyes toward me, her face hardening into a glare. She demanded that I thank my brother-in-law immediately. She told me $10,000 was more money than I probably made in an entire year, and that Julian was being far too generous to someone acting as ungrateful as I was. My father, Warren, nodded in vigorous agreement. He raised his wine glass slightly toward Julian, calling him a true gentleman and a prime example of what a real provider looked like. Vanessa looked briefly annoyed that Julian was handing me any money at all, but he reached under the table and patted her knee, silently, assuring her it was merely a small, necessary cost of doing business. Once Julian had successfully secured the absolute worship of my parents, his demeanor shifted again. The soft, sympathetic savior vanished, replaced instantly by the hurried corporate executive. He tapped his index finger sharply against the signature line of the quitclaim deed. He told me that while he was happy to provide this financial cushion, the business world waited for no one. He dropped his voice a full octave, injecting a false sense of extreme urgency into the conversation. He stated that the market was currently experiencing unprecedented volatility, and his institutional partners required immediate, agile capital deployment to secure their positions. He started throwing out heavy corporate buzzwords rapid fire, hoping to confuse and overwhelm me. He talked about synergistic asset allocation, mezzanine financing tranches, and critical path funding timelines. He insisted that his banking syndicate required the collateral finalized and filed by Friday morning at the absolute latest. He warned me that if I did not sign the deed right now, the entire Tier 1 acquisition would fall through. He claimed hundreds of millions of dollars were hanging in the balance, and the livelihoods of his elite team depended entirely on my cooperation tonight. He painted a picture of a massive high-stakes Wall Street transaction that would collapse simply because I was being too stubborn to sign a piece of paper. The sheer theatricality of his performance was almost impressive. He was sweating slightly under the collar of his expensive shirt, his eyes locked onto the deed with a desperate, hungry intensity. I sat perfectly still, listening to the frantic undercurrent vibrating beneath his polished vocabulary. Agile capital deployment was just Julian speak for, "I need cash right now to stop the bleeding." I knew exactly why he was setting a strict Friday morning deadline, and it had absolutely nothing to do with a massive new acquisition. Friday was not the start of a lucrative deal. Friday was the end of the 30-day cure period for his largest defaulted commercial loan. If Julian did not provide the bank with a massive injection of unencumbered collateral by the close of business on Friday, the receivership process would officially begin. His firm would be seized, his assets would be liquidated, and his fraudulent empire would be exposed to the public. He was not trying to build a legacy. He was trying to buy himself one more month of oxygen. And the most pathetic part of his entire performance was the piece of paper sitting on my plate. The $10,000 check was the ultimate insult. Because I owned the holding company that was currently tearing through his financial records, I knew his exact liquid cash position. I knew for an absolute fact that his primary checking account had been completely frozen. The check he had just written with such a grand display of charity was entirely worthless. It was literally made of rubber. He was committing check fraud right in front of my parents in a desperate bid to steal my real estate. His strategy was painfully obvious. He wanted to intimidate me into signing the deed tonight. He would then rush to the bank tomorrow morning, use the clean equity of my grandmother's house to secure a desperately needed line of credit, and use those newly borrowed funds to cover the $10,000 check by the time I actually tried to deposit it next week. It was a pathetic, frantic shell game run by a man who was out of time and out of options. He stared at me, waiting for me to pick up the pen and fall into his trap. He believed his barrage of corporate jargon and fake generosity had completely neutralized me. I looked down at the worthless check, then up at his desperate, sweating face. I finally let a small, genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. I was done letting him speak. I reached out with my index finger and pressed it firmly against the center of the $10,000 check Julian had just slid across the table. I did not break eye contact with him as I slowly, deliberately pushed the piece of paper back toward his crystal glass of bourbon. The confident, practiced smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. He was expecting me to snatch the check up with desperate gratitude, or perhaps throw it back in a fit of emotional rage. He was entirely unprepared for the absolute icy calm radiating from my side of the table. I folded my hands together, resting them lightly on the mahogany wood. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the room feel incredibly uncomfortable. Then I asked him my first question. I asked him how exactly he was planning to leverage a residential property deed to collateralize a Tier 2 commercial debt obligation when his primary fund was currently operating with a negative liquidity ratio. The words left my mouth with perfect articulation and absolute precision. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The smug, arrogant smirk did not just fade from his face, it violently vanished as if he had been struck by physical lightning. His hand, which had been casually resting on the stem of his glass, completely froze. The ice cubes in his bourbon stopped clinking. The entire dining room went perfectly quiet. Even the ambient noise from the kitchen seemed to evaporate. Julian stared at me, his eyes suddenly wide and completely devoid of the condescending warmth he had projected just moments before. He was looking at me as if a ghost had just materialized in the chair where his pathetic sister-in-law was supposed to be sitting. He knew instantly that I had not simply strung together a random assortment of financial buzzwords. The terminology I used was far too specific and far too accurate. To an outsider like my parents, it sounded like high-level corporate jargon, but to Julian it sounded like a death sentence. It was the exact internal language used by forensic accountants when they were preparing to liquidate a failing portfolio. The sudden terrifying realization that I understood the intricate architecture of his industry washed over him in a visible wave. I watched the blood drain out of his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly color. A single bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the light from the chandelier overhead. Vanessa was entirely oblivious to the monumental shift in power that had just occurred right next to her. She let out a loud, irritated sigh and rolled her eyes. She waved her hand dismissively at me, telling Julian not to listen to my ridiculous babbling. She turned to our father and complained that I was just making up big words to try and sound smart because I was embarrassed about needing money. She expected Julian to immediately agree with her, to laugh at my supposed ignorance and to put me back in my place. She looked at her husband, waiting for the witty, crushing comeback that would humiliate me in front of our parents. But Julian could not speak. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he finally managed to swallow hard. He tried to force a chuckle, but it sounded hollow and breathless, like a man grasping for air in a vacuum. He shifted uncomfortably in his antique chair, the luxurious fabric of his suit suddenly looking heavy and suffocating. He stammered out a weak sentence asking me where I had heard those specific terms. He attempted to inject a note of patronizing amusement back into his voice, claiming that I must have read an article online and completely misunderstood how high-level hedge funds operated. He was desperately, frantically trying to rebuild the facade, but his hands were trembling slightly against the white tablecloth. I did not let him breathe. I leaned forward slightly, closing the psychological distance between us. I kept my voice perfectly even, completely devoid of the hysteria they always expected from me. I told him I did not read an article. I told him I was simply curious about the margin calls his primary lender had issued last Tuesday afternoon. I asked him specifically how he intended to clear the covenants on his mezzanine debt when over 80% of his portfolio was currently tied up in dead commercial real estate that was failing to generate even basic operational revenue. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Warren and Brenda were completely lost. They looked back and forth between me and Julian, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and deep concern. They did not understand the financial specifics I was laying out, but they absolutely understood body language. They could see the undeniable terror radiating from their golden son-in-law. Warren cleared his throat, an uncertain sound that lacked his usual booming authority. He looked at Julian and asked him what I was talking about. Warren told Julian to just explain the situation and clear up my obvious confusion. He was throwing Julian a lifeline, begging him to reassert his dominance over the table. Julian stared back at my father, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal looking for an exit. He could not explain it away. He could not tell them I was confused because every single word I had just spoken was the absolute, devastating truth. The massive commercial real estate portfolio he had bragged about acquiring was actually a toxic sinking ship that was dragging his entire firm into bankruptcy. He had gambled his clients' money on high-risk properties, and the market had completely wiped him out. He was currently hiding from his creditors, dodging phone calls from furious investors, and frantically trying to steal my house just to keep the lights on in his office for one more week. He looked back at me, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. The realization that I knew his deepest, darkest secrets was completely paralyzing him. He demanded to know who I had been talking to. His voice was no longer smooth and controlled. It was a harsh, desperate whisper. He accused me of illegally accessing his private corporate servers. He accused me of hiring private investigators to spy on his firm. He was desperately searching for any logical explanation that would allow him to maintain his victimhood. He wanted to believe I had cheated to get this information because the alternative, that I was simply smarter, more capable, and vastly more powerful than he ever imagined, was too terrifying for his fragile ego to accept. I sat back in my chair enjoying the spectacular view of his crumbling empire. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The truth was doing all the heavy lifting for me. I told him I did not need to spy on his office, and I certainly did not need to hack his servers. I told him that when a man is $3 million in the red, his financial data tends to become a matter of public record for anyone who knows exactly where to look. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as the final shreds of his false reality burned away. I had successfully pulled the first thread, and his entire tailored suit was unraveling right before my eyes. I did not give Julian a single second to recover from the shock of my initial statement. I shifted my gaze away from his pale, sweating face and looked down at the $10,000 check still resting near his crystal bourbon glass. I reached across the table and picked it up, holding the crisp paper by the very edge as if it were physically contaminated. I looked directly at Vanessa, who was still completely oblivious to the panic consuming her husband. I told her that her brilliant, successful husband was not just a remarkably incompetent fund manager, but he was also a remarkably sloppy criminal. I stated in a clear, unwavering voice that writing a personal check for $10,000 from a primary operating account that had been legally frozen by commercial creditors at exactly noon on Wednesday was considered federal bank fraud. I did not stop there. I detailed the exact mechanics of his failure so there could be absolutely no room for misunderstanding. I told the table that the primary commercial lending institution in downtown Atlanta had officially locked his accounts due to a massive covenant breach. I noted that Julian had desperately tried and failed to withdraw liquid cash on Thursday morning, just hours before arriving at this dinner. I explained that the check he had written with such a grand flourish of fake charity was not worth the paper it was printed on. It was a completely worthless document handed to me by a desperate cornered man who was trying to buy just enough time to steal my real estate and save himself from total financial ruin. I let the check drop from my fingers. It fluttered down and landed directly in a small puddle of condensation that had formed beneath the crystal water pitcher, the ink immediately beginning to bleed and blur into a dark, useless smudge. The eruption at the dining table was instantaneous and deafening. It was as if I had casually tossed a live grenade right into the center of the roasted turkey. Vanessa was the first to completely lose her mind. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the mahogany table with such extreme force that the silver forks jumped off the porcelain plates and clattered against the crystal goblets. She stood up so violently that her heavy antique dining chair was knocked backward, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud, heavy crash. Her face, which had been meticulously contoured and painted for a flawless holiday aesthetic, was suddenly contorted with raw, absolute rage. Her carefully constructed mask of wealthy indifference was completely destroyed. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face and screamed at the top of her lungs that I was a pathetic, jealous liar. Vanessa shrieked that I had spent my entire miserable life resenting her massive success and her beautiful, perfect marriage. She accused me of fabricating these ridiculous, complicated financial terms just to humiliate Julian, because I was bitterly obsessed with the fact that I was 35 years old and completely alone. She yelled so loudly that a visible vein bulged in her neck, her voice echoing harshly off the expensive wallpaper of the dining room. She frantically turned to our parents, claiming that I was probably going through some kind of severe psychotic break brought on by the immense stress of my failing freelance career. She desperately tried to spin my calm, factual statements into the unhinged ravings of a jealous sibling desperate for any kind of attention. She turned to Julian and begged him to say something to put me in my place and prove me wrong. But Julian remained absolutely frozen in his seat, staring blankly at the bleeding ink on the ruined check, absorbing the terrifying reality of his absolute destruction. My mother, Brenda, immediately sprang into action to defend her precious golden child. She stood up quickly, rushing around the table to wrap her arms around Vanessa, who had immediately transitioned from screaming rage to loud theatrical sobbing. Brenda glared at me over the shoulder of my sister, with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred I had never witnessed from her before. She demanded that I stop this ridiculous, deeply offensive charade right this instant. She ordered me to look directly at my brother-in-law and apologize for disrespecting him in her home on Thanksgiving. She yelled that I was an ungrateful, spiteful daughter who had intentionally planned this vicious, unprovoked attack to completely ruin the only holiday where the family could be happy and united. She actually went so far as to claim that my toxic, jealous behavior was the exact reason why I had never found a husband, stating as a matter of absolute fact that no man would ever want to build a life with a woman so full of baseless venom and bitterness. My father Warren stood up next, towering over his end of the long table to assert his ultimate authority. His face was flushed a dark, dangerous red with anger. He pointed his thick index finger at me, his booming executive voice rattling the delicate glassware. He told me that I had officially crossed a line tonight, that I could never hope to uncross. He warned me using a tone of heavy intimidation that accusing a respected finance professional of bank fraud was a serious case of slander, and that Julian would be well within his legal rights to sue me for every single penny I owned. Warren demanded that I pick up the silver pen and sign the quitclaim deed right now as a formal binding apology for the insane criminal accusations I had just thrown across his dinner table. He told me that if I did not sign the paper, hand over the house, and apologize to Julian immediately, I would be permanently disowned, completely cut off from the family, and never allowed to set foot inside his house again. They were all screaming at me simultaneously, creating a chaotic cacophony of threats, insults, and desperate, pathetic denials. They were fighting tooth and nail to protect a fragile illusion that had already shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. They completely refused to look at the terrified, guilty silence of Julian. They refused to ask themselves why the brilliant, successful fund manager was not defending his own honor or threatening to call his lawyers. Instead, they focused all their blinding rage and fear entirely on the messenger. I sat perfectly still in the very center of their raging storm, listening to their voices crack and break under the crushing weight of their own panic. I did not raise my voice to shout over them. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel any need whatsoever to defend myself against their frantic, baseless insults. I simply waited. I watched my family tear themselves apart to defend a man who was stealing from them. I knew their screams were just the dying gasps of the false hierarchy they had used to control me my entire life. They were demanding an apology for exposing a massive fraud. They had absolutely no idea that the real punishment had not even begun. I let them scream. I let their frantic, baseless threats wash over me like water off a stone. My father Warren was still standing at the head of the table, his chest heaving with manufactured outrage, demanding I pick up the silver pen and sign my home away. My mother Brenda was clutching Vanessa, who was still putting on a spectacular theatrical display of victimhood, sobbing into her linen napkin. They were a united front of chaos, desperately trying to drown out the devastating truth I had just dropped onto their holiday table. I did not raise my voice to compete with their hysteria. I did not flinch when Warren threatened to disown me. Instead, I slowly reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my structured leather tote bag. I placed the heavy bag squarely on my lap. The heavy brass zipper made a distinct sharp sound as I pulled it open. It was a quiet mechanical noise, but it seemed to slice right through the hysterical shouting of my mother and sister. I reached inside, bypassing my makeup bag and my wallet. My fingers wrapped around the smooth matte finish of a single pristine black folder. I pulled it out and placed it flat on the table right next to my crystal water glass. Vanessa stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second. She peeked through her perfectly manicured fingers, her tear-streaked face contorting into a look of greedy anticipation. She genuinely believed the black folder contained a signed copy of the quitclaim deed, or perhaps a massive cashier check representing my total surrender. She thought my silence meant I had finally buckled under the overwhelming pressure of our parents. She nudged our mother and quickly wiped her eyes, preparing to snatch the folder the second I pushed it toward her. Even Julian lifted his head slightly, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope sparking in his panicked eyes. He actually thought I was going to save him. I did not look at Vanessa. I did not look at Julian. I picked up the black folder and held it firmly in both hands. I leaned forward and slid it straight down the center of the long mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the white tablecloth, bypassing the silver gravy boat, passing right by the magnificent roasted turkey, and stopping dead center in front of my father. I looked up at Warren. His face was still dark red with fury, his heavy index finger still pointing at me in a gesture of ultimate paternal authority. I told him he did not need to take my word for anything. I told him to open the folder and read the very first page out loud to his beautiful, united family. Warren scoffed loudly. He muttered something deeply insulting under his breath about my ridiculous, childish theatrics. He aggressively snatched the folder off the table, intending to glance at it and immediately dismiss whatever fabricated proof he thought I had brought. He flipped the heavy black cover open with a harsh, dismissive flick of his wrist. I watched his eyes track down to the thick, cream-colored legal paper resting inside. I knew exactly what that document looked like because my own legal team had drafted it. It bore the heavy embossed seal of a major commercial banking institution in the top left corner. Across the top center, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, were the words, "Formal notice of default and intent to seize assets." I watched the exact moment the brutal reality of the situation crashed into my father. It was a spectacular physical transformation. The dark, furious red coloring completely drained out of his face, replaced instantly by an ashen, sickly gray. His heavy, authoritative posture simply collapsed. His broad executive shoulders slumped forward, and the hand holding the edge of the stiff black folder began to tremble violently. His eyes, which had just been glaring at me with absolute hatred, widened in sheer unadulterated horror as they scanned the densely typed paragraphs of financial ruin. He was reading the exact sum of Julian catastrophic debt. It was a number so massive, so incredibly reckless, that it completely defied his comprehension. The booming, executive voice of my father vanished entirely. He opened his mouth to speak, to scream, to demand another explanation, but only a dry, rattling breath escaped his lips. The silence that suddenly radiated from his end of the table was so profound and so terrifying that it immediately choked the screaming right out of my mother and sister. Brenda stopped yelling her insults mid-sentence. Vanessa lowered her hands completely from her face, her fake tears drying up instantly. They both stared at Warren, utterly confused and suddenly terrified by the sight of the untouchable patriarch, completely paralyzed by a single piece of paper. The black folder lay completely open on the table, resting right next to a crystal bowl of sweet cranberry sauce. The visual contrast was absurd and deeply poetic. On one side was the meticulous, expensive illusion of a perfect holiday feast, prepared by a family absolutely obsessed with their social status. On the other side was the brutal, undeniable legal reality of their complete financial destruction. Warren could not tear his eyes away from the paper. He read the final paragraph, the section detailing the immediate freeze of all connected liquid assets and the impending aggressive liquidation of Julian corporate shell companies. He slowly lowered the folder back onto the tablecloth, his hands shaking so badly he knocked over his own wine glass. The dark red liquid spilled across the white linen, looking like fresh blood, but Warren did not even notice. He did not look at my mother. He did not look at my sister. He looked up directly at his golden son-in-law. The man he had just toasted as a true gentleman and a brilliant provider was sitting frozen in his chair, sweating through his expensive tailored suit. Julian could not meet my father's eyes. Julian stared down at his empty dinner plate, his jaw clenched tight, his entire body rigid with the absolute terror of a man who knew he was finally caught. Brenda reached out tentatively and touched Warren's arm. She asked him in a small, frightened voice what the paper said. She asked him why he was looking at Julian like that. Warren did not answer her. He could not form the words. He simply pushed the black folder slightly toward the center of the table, an open invitation for anyone brave enough to read the truth. I sat back in my chair, completely relaxed, watching the magnificent collapse of the golden child and her perfect husband. I had delivered the weapon, and now I was simply waiting for the inevitable explosion. The silence stretching across the dining room was absolute, broken only by the sound of my father trying to catch his breath. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and decided to translate the dense legal document he was holding into plain, undeniable English. I looked directly at my sister, who was staring at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. I told her that her husband was not a financial genius orchestrating massive corporate acquisitions. I reminded the table of the complicated corporate buzzwords Julian had confidently thrown around just minutes earlier. I explained that when Julian talked about agile capital deployment, he was actually talking about frantically moving cash from one overdrawn account to another to prevent his checks from bouncing. When he bragged about his high-yield commercial properties, he was actually talking about a series of failing suburban strip malls that had been sitting vacant and decaying for 3 years. He had taken millions of dollars of his investors' money and dumped it into completely dead real estate, hoping a miracle would save him. There was no miracle. The market shifted, the property values plummeted, and his entire portfolio collapsed right along with it. I turned my attention back to my father, whose hands were still resting rigidly on the mahogany table. I pointed to the second page of the document still visible beneath the heavy black cover. I told him to look at the total liability figure printed in bold ink at the very bottom of the page. $3.2 million. I spoke the number slowly, letting the massive weight of it crush the last remaining hope out of the room. That was the exact amount of money Julian currently owed to a syndicate of incredibly angry commercial lenders. His investment fund was not a thriving corporate empire expanding its reach. It was a hollow, pathetic shell game. He had been borrowing money from one bank to pay the massive interest penalties on a loan from another bank. The massive new venture he had bragged about securing by Friday morning was a complete fabrication. He did not need my house to launch a lucrative new deal. He desperately needed the clean, unencumbered equity of Grandma Josephine House, simply to plug a massive bleeding hole in his sinking ship before the bank formally seized everything he owned. Vanessa let out a sharp, trembling breath, shaking her head in frantic, aggressive denial. She looked at Julian and demanded he tell me I was lying. She yelled that they had plenty of money and practically screamed about the brand new custom Porsche sitting in our parents' driveway right at that very moment. I did not let Julian speak. I answered for him with surgical precision. I told Vanessa that the luxurious exotic car was not a symbol of his massive success, but rather the ultimate proof of his absolute desperation. I explained that the car was leased under the name of one of his failing corporate shell companies, which had defaulted on its payments 2 months ago. The lender had already issued a formal notice of repossession 48 hours prior. I informed my sister in a completely flat, steady voice that if she looked closely out the front window, she might actually see the tow truck circling the neighborhood waiting for the holiday dinner to end. The magnificent ski trip to Aspen, the expensive country club memberships, the imported designer suits. Julian was wearing it was all entirely funded by catastrophic high-interest debt that was actively being called in. I looked at Julian, who was shrinking smaller and smaller into his antique dining chair. His broad, confident shoulders were hunched forward, and his arrogant smirk was permanently erased. He looked like a deflated balloon. I systematically stripped away every single lie he had told since walking through the front door. I told my parents that Julian had absolutely no intention of releasing the house back to me in 6 months because his firm would not even exist in 6 days. If I had picked up that silver pen and signed the quitclaim deed today, the commercial bank would have immediately consumed my property to cover a fraction of his massive corporate debt. I would have been thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing, losing my only sanctuary, and Julian would have still gone completely bankrupt by the end of the year. He was perfectly willing to destroy my life, strip away my only inheritance, and leave me completely homeless, just to buy himself a few more pathetic weeks of pretending to be a wealthy hedge fund manager in front of his country club friends. My mother Brenda finally found her voice, but it was nothing more than a fragile, terrified whisper that cracked in the quiet room. She looked at Julian, the golden son-in-law she had practically worshipped and aggressively defended for the past 5 years, and asked him if any of what I was saying was true. Julian squeezed his eyes shut and let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He could not even lift his head to look his mother-in-law in the face. His cowardly silence was the most deafening confession possible. Warren slumped back heavily against his chair, looking as though he had physically aged 10 years in the span of 3 minutes. The prestigious, wealthy family legacy he thought he was building was nothing but a fragile house of cards built entirely on fraud and deceit. They had spent the entire evening mocking my career, treating me like a pathetic charity case, and demanding I sacrifice my life for a man who was actively trying to rob them blind. Vanessa began to hyperventilate. Her perfectly manicured hands clawed frantically at the expensive silk fabric of her dress as the terrifying reality of her situation finally breached her massive wall of denial. She was not the wealthy, untouchable socialite she had pretended to be just 20 minutes ago when she was bragging about ski resorts and laughing at my expense. She was the wife of a massive fraud about to lose her home, her cars, and her entire social standing in the most public, humiliating way possible. I watched the golden child completely shatter right in front of my eyes. The supreme arrogance that had fueled her cruelty toward me for her entire life was entirely gone, replaced by raw, suffocating panic. I had not raised my voice once. I had not thrown a single petty insult. I had simply turned the lights on and forced them to look at the ugly, terrifying truth they had been so desperate to ignore. I sat perfectly still, watching the ashes of their fake empire settle around the ruined Thanksgiving feast, knowing that the most devastating part of my revelation was still locked safely inside my mind. Julian sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, staring blindly at the ruined check before him. The crushing weight of exposure finally broke through his paralysis, and the polished, sophisticated fund manager completely vanished. In his place was a desperate, cornered man who realized his entire life was over. His face flushed a dark, mottled red, the veins in his neck bulging against the tight collar of his custom-tailored shirt. He let out a primal, furious roar and slammed both of his fists down onto the mahogany table with terrifying force. The impact was so violent that a crystal water goblet toppled over, shattering against a porcelain plate and sending shards of glass flying across the white tablecloth. My mother screamed and jumped back, but I did not even blink. I sat perfectly still, watching his complete psychological collapse. Julian shoved his heavy antique chair backward so violently that it crashed into the floral wallpaper behind him. He stood up, towering over the table, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and completely unfocused. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He abandoned all pretense of corporate professionalism and resorted to the frantic, desperate accusations of a man who had absolutely no defense. He yelled that I was a criminal. He accused me of hiring a team of elite corporate hackers to infiltrate his private servers and steal his confidential client data. He screamed that I had engaged in massive corporate espionage just to ruin him because I was jealous of his success and his beautiful wife. He was completely unhinged, throwing out wild legal threats and claiming he was going to have me arrested by the FBI before the night was over. His logic was entirely fractured by panic. In one breath, he claimed the documents in the black folder were complete fabrications forged by me to destroy his reputation. In the very next breath, he screamed that the information was highly classified and I had broken federal laws to obtain it. He was drowning in his own contradictions, desperately searching for a narrative that would paint him as the victim of a malicious attack rather than the architect of a massive fraud. He leaned over the table, bracing his knuckles against the wood, and thrust his face toward mine. The smell of bourbon and absolute terror radiated off him. He tried to physically intimidate me, his voice dropping into a harsh, menacing growl. He demanded to know who I was working for. He insisted that a pathetic freelance web designer could never have orchestrated such a massive breach of security on her own. He demanded I tell him which of his corporate rivals had paid me to destroy his firm. Vanessa, who had been hyperventilating quietly, suddenly dissolved into a full-blown hysterical meltdown. She saw the absolute terror in her husband's eyes and heard the desperate, impossible lies he was spinning, and the final brick of her massive wall of denial simply crumbled. She covered her face with both hands and began sobbing uncontrollably, her wails echoing loudly through the dining room. She turned to our father, grabbing his arm with desperate, clawing fingers. She begged Warren to make me stop lying. She cried that I was ruining her life, ruining her marriage, and destroying the family on Thanksgiving. She pleaded with him to throw me out of the house and call the police. She was clinging to the rapidly fading illusion that Warren still possessed the ultimate authority to fix everything. She wanted him to use his booming voice to banish me and somehow magically erase the crushing debt that was about to consume her entire world. But Warren did not move. He did not pull Vanessa into a comforting embrace. He did not yell at me or threaten to call the police. He simply stared at Julian, the man who was currently screaming about hackers and corporate espionage, while standing over a table covered in shattered glass and spilled wine. Warren was a prideful, arrogant man, but he was not stupid. He had spent decades in the corporate world, and he recognized the smell of a guilty man. He looked at the black folder still resting near the cranberry sauce. The heavy embossed seal of the commercial bank was undeniable. The meticulous financial detailing of the default notice could not be forged by a freelance web designer with a grudge. Warren slowly pulled his arm out of Vanessa's desperate grip. The subtle physical rejection sent Vanessa into a renewed fit of sobbing, but Warren ignored her. He looked at Julian, and his silence was louder than any accusation I could have made. Julian saw Warren pull away from Vanessa, and his panic escalated into absolute frenzy. He realized that he was losing his most powerful ally. Without Warren's financial backing and social influence, Julian was completely defenseless against his creditors. He turned his desperate attention away from me and focused entirely on my father. He began pleading with Warren, his voice cracking with desperation. He claimed that the debt was just a temporary misunderstanding, a minor clerical error made by an incompetent junior analyst. He promised he could fix everything by Monday morning if Warren would just write him a bridge loan to cover the immediate margin calls. He was practically begging his father-in-law for millions of dollars right there in the middle of the ruined Thanksgiving feast, completely abandoning the confident, wealthy persona he had worn just 30 minutes ago. Julian was a drowning man, grabbing onto anyone he could reach, trying to pull my parents down into the crushing depths of his financial ruin. He promised Warren massive returns on the loan, offering him equity in the failing strip malls, and swearing on his life that the deal was entirely secure. It was pathetic and nauseating to watch. He was trying to hustle his own father-in-law mere minutes after trying to steal his sister-in-law house. I watched Julian beg, sweating through his imported silk tie, his eyes wide with a feral, desperate energy. I did not interrupt him. I let him thoroughly disgust my parents. I let him expose the absolute core of his cowardly, greedy nature. He was terrified because he thought I had stolen his information and was going to hand it over to his creditors. He had absolutely no idea that I did not need to hand the information to his creditors because I was the one holding his leash. I watched Julian grovel at the feet of my father. It was a pathetic display of a man entirely stripped of his unearned pride. He was sweating profusely through his expensive silk shirt, completely ignoring the shattered glass and the spilled wine surrounding his plate. He begged for a bridge loan, throwing out desperate promises of high returns and massive equity in properties that were actively rotting from the inside out. My father, Warren, simply stared at him in horrified silence. The booming patriarch who had spent the entire evening demanding my submission was now completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the fraud sitting at his dining table. Vanessa was still weeping uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands, completely incapable of processing the terrifying reality that her luxurious life was nothing but an illusion built on stolen money. I let the chaotic symphony of their despair fill the room for a few more moments before I decided it was time to drop the second devastating bomb. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to compete with the loud, panicked breathing of my brother-in-law. I simply placed both of my hands flat on the mahogany table and leaned forward. I spoke directly to Julian, cutting through his frantic begging with a voice as cold and hard as a diamond. I told him to stop humiliating himself. I told him he was wasting his breath asking my father for money, because my father did not have the capital required to cover a $3 million margin call. Furthermore, I explained that even if Warren did somehow possess that kind of liquidity, handing it over to Julian would be entirely useless at this point. Julian stopped talking instantly. His mouth snapped shut, and he turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with the feral panic of a trapped animal. He was still clinging to his ridiculous theory of corporate espionage, still believing that I was just a rogue hacker who had stolen his information and was preparing to blackmail him. I decided to relieve him of that particular delusion. I looked him dead in the eye and explained that absolutely no hacking was required to obtain his financial data. I told him I did not need to hire a team of elite cybercriminals to infiltrate his private servers, because his servers were practically an open book to anyone holding the right legal authority. I told him I had completely legal, unfettered access to every single detail of his debt profile, his failing properties, and his frozen bank accounts. Julian shook his head rapidly, refusing to believe me. He stammered out a weak demand, asking how a freelance web designer could possibly have legal access to the heavily guarded financial records of a commercial hedge fund. I smiled, a small, tight expression, completely devoid of warmth. I decided to give him a brief, heavily simplified lesson in high-level corporate finance. I explained that when a portfolio manager acts as recklessly as he did and defaults on millions of dollars of commercial loans, the primary lending institution eventually runs out of patience. They do not want to carry that massive toxic debt on their own balance sheets. Instead, they package those distressed assets together and sell them off at a steep discount to private holding companies who specialize in aggressive asset liquidation. I watched the wheels slowly begin to turn in his panicked mind. I told him that his primary lender, the same massive bank he had been dodging phone calls from all week, had finally reached their breaking point. On Monday morning, they had officially auctioned off the entire catastrophic mess of his defaulted loans to an independent private equity firm. Julian swallowed hard, a visible lump bobbing in his throat. He whispered the name of the private equity firm that had been hunting him all week. He muttered the words, Obsidian Asset Management, under his breath, his voice trembling with absolute terror. He knew the name perfectly well, because Obsidian was the entity that had aggressively frozen his primary operating accounts at exactly noon on Wednesday. Obsidian was the invisible monster that was actively tearing down his fake empire and preparing to liquidate his life. I nodded slowly, confirming his worst fear. I told him his memory was absolutely correct and commended him for finally reading his legal mail. I then calmly stated the final undeniable truth that would shatter his reality forever. I informed Julian that Obsidian Asset Management was not a massive faceless Wall Street conglomerate. I explained that Obsidian was a highly specialized private holding company created exclusively for the purpose of acquiring distressed commercial debt in the greater Atlanta area. I paused, letting the heavy silence wrap around the room before delivering the final blow. I told him that I was the founder, the chief executive officer, and the sole proprietor of Obsidian Asset Management. The reaction was absolute profound silence. The revelation was so massive, so incredibly unexpected, that it completely short-circuited their collective ability to react. Julian stared at me, his jaw slightly unhinged, looking at me, as if I had just transformed into a mythical creature right in front of his eyes. My mother, Brenda, gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. Her diamond earrings caught the light as her head snapped toward me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Even Vanessa lowered her hands from her tear-streaked face, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. They were trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, submissive family scapegoat with the ruthless corporate entity that had just single-handedly dismantled their golden boy. I did not let the silence stretch for too long. I wanted to make sure Julian understood the exact nature of the trap he had walked into. I clarified my position for him using the very corporate buzzwords he had tried to intimidate me with earlier. I told him I was not just a knowledgeable bystander who had stumbled upon his dirty secrets. I told him that by purchasing the distressed assets from his primary lender, I had assumed total legal control over every single one of his financial obligations. I owned the massive loan on his failing suburban strip malls. I owned the high-interest lease on his custom Porsche sitting in the driveway. I owned the exorbitant lines of credit he was using to fund his fake luxury ski trips to Aspen. I told him that I was legally, undeniably, and irrevocably his primary creditor. I watched the last spark of hope completely extinguish in his eyes. Julian slumped so far down in his antique dining chair it looked like his spine had dissolved entirely. The luxurious tailored suit he wore now looked like a borrowed costume that was 3 sizes too big. The arrogant, condescending man who had tried to write me a fake $10,000 check to steal my grandmother's house was now sitting across from the woman who literally owned his entire future. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the very person he had spent the evening mocking and belittling was the only person on the planet holding the power to destroy him or save him. I explained that when I ordered his accounts frozen on Wednesday, I knew he would become desperate. I knew a man with his level of blinding arrogance would try to leverage the only unencumbered asset he could think of, which was the house our grandmother left me. I let him walk into this dinner, let him perform his pathetic charade, let him show my parents exactly who he was, because I wanted them to witness his true cowardly character before I took everything away. He had brought a quitclaim deed to Thanksgiving dinner, hoping to bully a helpless freelancer into surrendering her only sanctuary. Instead, he had walked directly into the waiting jaws of the apex predator who had already bought his entire world. I sat comfortably in my chair, the unquestioned architect of his destruction, waiting to see what my family would do now that they were entirely at my mercy. The absolute silence in the dining room lasted for exactly 15 seconds before the sheer psychological weight of my statement fractured my parents' reality. The cognitive dissonance hit them with the force of a physical blow. For 35 years, they had carefully constructed and maintained a rigid family hierarchy. In their world, Vanessa was the brilliant shining star, and I was the pathetic struggling failure. Their entire identities as successful parents were built upon this unshakable foundation. The idea that their designated disappointment had secretly built a corporate entity capable of swallowing Julian's entire financial existence was simply impossible for them to process. Their brains aggressively rejected the information. Instead of accepting the undeniable truth sitting in the black folder right in front of them, they immediately pivoted to the only narrative that allowed their fragile worldview to survive. They decided I was lying. My mother Brenda was the first to vocalize the denial. She let out a sharp, dismissive scoff and waved her hand aggressively in my direction as if she could physically bat away the words I had just spoken. She told me to stop this ridiculous, embarrassing performance right now. Her voice was trembling, but she forced it into a tone of maternal scolding. She looked at Warren and then at Vanessa, loudly declaring that there was absolutely no way I owned a private equity firm. She reminded the table that I was just a freelance web designer who built silly little websites from a laptop in my living room. She claimed I did not have a business degree, I did not have any corporate connections, and I certainly did not possess the millions of dollars required to purchase commercial debt portfolios. She looked at me with an expression of pure disgust and accused me of printing fake legal documents off the internet just to play a sick, twisted joke on my sister. Warren immediately latched onto Brenda theory. He desperately needed it to be true. He reached out and grabbed the black folder again, pulling it close to his chest like a shield. He adjusted his glasses and began scrutinizing the thick cream-colored paper with frantic, aggressive energy. He ran his thick thumb over the embossed seal of the commercial bank, desperately searching for any sign of forgery. He leaned forward, his face flushing red once again, and pointed his silver carving fork directly at me. He dropped his voice into a harsh, threatening register. He told me that forging federal banking documents was a serious felony offense. He stated that I had gone way too far this time, and that my jealous obsession with Vanessa had finally crossed the line into criminal insanity. He actually threatened to call his own lawyers on Monday morning to have me investigated for fraud. The sheer absurdity of their logic was breathtaking. My parents were looking at a legally binding notice of default, complete with verified account numbers and authorized corporate signatures. Yet they were actively choosing to believe that I had spent weeks meticulously forging federal banking documents, committing multiple felonies, and risking decades in prison simply to pull a prank at Thanksgiving dinner. They preferred the image of their daughter as a deranged criminal over the reality of their daughter as a highly successful chief executive officer. Their desperate need to keep me at the bottom of the family hierarchy was stronger than their basic common sense. Vanessa heard the confident denial in our parents' voices and immediately grabbed onto it like a drowning woman finding a piece of driftwood. The raw panic that had just consumed her face was quickly replaced by a vicious, venomous hatred. She slammed her hands on the table and leaned toward me, her eyes wide and unhinged. She screamed that I was a complete psychopath. She accused me of spending months orchestrating this elaborate lie just to humiliate her and Julian because I could not stand the fact that they were happy. She yelled that I was a bitter, lonely woman who had to invent a fake company because I had absolutely nothing real in my own miserable life. She turned to Julian, shaking his shoulder violently. She begged him to speak up to tell my parents that Obsidian Asset Management was a fake company and that I was completely out of my mind. But Julian could not provide her with the comfort she was violently demanding. He remained slumped in his chair, staring at the ruined check with hollow, dead eyes. He knew the documents were real. He knew Obsidian was real. He had spent the last 72 hours speaking to their legal representatives, desperately trying to negotiate a settlement. He knew exactly who held his debt, but he simply lacked the courage to tell his wife that her sister was the one holding the axe. His silence infuriated Warren. My father slammed the black folder down onto the mahogany table and demanded Julian explain what was happening. Warren told Julian to look at me and put me in my place. Warren wanted the golden son-in-law to rise up and crush the rebellious daughter with his superior financial intellect. When Julian still refused to speak, Warren turned his full absolute fury back onto me. He decided that if Julian was too shocked by my insane behavior to defend himself, then Warren would step up and protect the family honor. He stood up straight, puffing out his chest to project maximum intimidation. He told me that he was deeply ashamed to call me his daughter. He stated that my behavior tonight was the most disgusting display of jealousy he had ever witnessed in his entire life. He demanded I pack up my things and leave his house immediately. He told me he was giving me exactly 5 minutes to walk out the front door before he physically removed me himself. He warned me that if I did not sign the quitclaim deed on my way out, he would personally ensure I was sued for defamation and forgery. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the full impact of their absolute rejection. Even when presented with undeniable proof of my power, their first instinct was to crush me to protect the fragile egos of the golden couple. They did not care about the truth. They only cared about the narrative. They could not understand how a woman they had spent a decade dismissing as a broke freelancer could suddenly command millions of dollars in liquid capital. They needed to know where the money came from. The holding company revelation was devastating to Julian, but to my parents it was an impossible math equation they refused to solve. I realized that breaking their wall of denial required more than just showing them the debt I owned. I needed to show them the wealth I had built. I needed to provide the final fatal piece of evidence that would completely shatter their reality and leave them with absolutely no room for doubt or denial. I reached my hand back into my leather tote bag. I knew exactly what I had to pull out next. I kept my hand buried inside my leather tote bag, letting my father finish his furious, unhinged rant. I let him threaten me with his lawyers. I let him demand my physical removal from the house. I let Vanessa scream her final venomous insults about my miserable, lonely life. I wanted them to completely exhaust their pathetic arsenal of denial. I wanted them to empty every single cartridge of their manufactured superiority before I delivered the final fatal blow. Once the dining room fell back into a heavy, breathless silence, broken only by the sound of Julian quietly hyperventilating, I pulled my hand out of the bag. I was holding a single piece of heavy, glossy paper. It was not printed on standard home office stationery. It was a high-resolution professional printout directly from the public relations department of a major global financial news network. I placed the document face down on the table right next to the crystal water pitcher. I looked directly at Warren and told him I actually understood his confusion. I kept my voice incredibly calm, projecting the soothing authority of a seasoned executive dealing with an irrational subordinate. I explained that it must be incredibly difficult for a man who had spent his entire life measuring success by the brand of a leased car or the zip code of a mortgaged house to understand invisible digital wealth. I told him I did not need to forge federal bank documents because my capital had been thoroughly audited and verified by the Securities and Exchange Commission just 3 days ago. I reached out and slowly flipped the glossy paper over, pushing it across the white tablecloth until it rested directly on top of the black folder. I announced to the table that this was an embargoed press release. I paused and looked at Vanessa, whose tear-streaked face was twisted in utter bewilderment. I offered a cold, condescending smile and explained the definition of the word embargoed specifically for her benefit. I told her it meant the financial news network had already written and verified the story, but they were legally bound to hold the publication until exactly 8 o'clock on Monday morning. At that exact moment, the news would hit every major financial wire across the globe. Warren reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the glossy paper. He did not snatch it aggressively this time. He picked it up with a slow, terrifying reverence, as if he were handling a live explosive. As his eyes scanned the bold headline printed at the top of the page, his entire body simply froze. The residual anger that had been keeping him upright completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, gaping void of absolute comprehension. I did not wait for him to read it out loud. I narrated the contents of the page for the rest of my family, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum destructive force. I announced that my data analytics firm, the exact same company my mother had spent a decade mocking as a cute little computer hobby, had just been officially acquired. I stated the name of the acquiring company. It was a multinational tech giant, a household name whose devices and software were currently sitting in the pockets and on the wrists of everyone sitting at that Thanksgiving table. Then I dropped the final undeniable number, $57 million. I spoke the figure with slow, deliberate articulation. I emphasized that it was an all-cash transaction. There were no complicated stock options, no performance-based earnouts, and no delayed corporate payouts. It was $57 million of pure liquid capital transferring directly into my private accounts. The sheer magnitude of that number hit the dining room like a shockwave. It was a figure so massive, so entirely outside the realm of their suburban country club comprehension, that it completely broke their brains. My mother, Brenda, stopped breathing. She literally choked on the air in her lungs, her hand flying up to cover her mouth as her eyes bulged in absolute shock. The diamond earrings she was wearing, the ones she constantly flaunted as proof of her upper-middle-class status, suddenly looked like cheap plastic toys compared to the immense wealth I had just casually dropped onto her dinner table. Vanessa stared at me as if I had just started speaking a foreign language. Her brain could simply not process a number that massive. $57 million was not just wealth, it was dynasty money. It was the kind of money that bought holding companies and crushed fraudulent hedge fund managers before breakfast. Her entire identity, which was built entirely on being richer and better than me, was instantly vaporized. She was completely insignificant, and she finally knew it. Julian, who was already drowning in his own $3 million grave, slowly lifted his head and looked at me. Out of everyone in the room, he understood the brutal reality of that figure better than anyone. He worked in finance. He knew exactly what an all-cash acquisition of that size meant. He knew that $57 million made me practically untouchable. It made me a literal titan in his pathetic, desperate circles. The realization that he had tried to write a bouncing $10,000 check to a woman worth nearly $60 million physically sickened him. He looked like he was going to vomit right onto his porcelain plate. The supreme arrogance he had walked in with was entirely replaced by a crushing, suffocating terror. Warren dropped the glossy paper back onto the table. It landed perfectly across the notice of default, painting a complete, flawless masterpiece of my total victory. The man who had just threatened to physically throw me out of his house, who had demanded I surrender my home to save his fraudulent son-in-law, was now sitting in the presence of more wealth than his entire lineage had ever generated in a century. He looked at me, and for the very first time in my 35 years of life, I did not see disappointment in his eyes. I did not see paternal frustration or condescending anger. I saw pure, unadulterated fear. He was terrified of me. The daughter he had deemed a worthless embarrassment had secretly conquered the world while he was busy praising a criminal. I leaned back in my chair, completely at peace, feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my entire life. I looked at the four shattered people sitting around the beautiful ruined holiday table. I told them that the $10,000 rubber check Julian had offered me was less than what my firm generated in passive interest in a single afternoon. I looked at Vanessa and told her that her imaginary luxury ski trip to Aspen was nothing but pocket change to me. I had completely shattered the financial ceiling they had used to keep me trapped and subservient. The silence in the dining room was no longer born of shock or denial. It was born of absolute total submission. The undeniable reality of the $57 million washed over them, completely suffocating their delusions and breaking the very foundation of their toxic hierarchy forever. The crushing reality of the $57 million hung in the air for just a few moments before the entire power dynamic of my family completely shattered. I sat perfectly still and watched a psychological transformation so abrupt and so entirely devoid of shame that it actually made my stomach turn. For 35 years, my parents had enforced a brutal, rigid hierarchy where my worth was measured entirely by my lack of material success. I was the cautionary tale. I was the punching bag. But the second they fully comprehended the massive, undeniable wealth sitting across their dining table, their brains simply short-circuited. They instantly rewrote decades of history to align themselves with the new center of power. My father, Warren, was the first to break. The dark, furious red coloring that had painted his face while he threatened to throw me out of the house instantly vanished. He let out a strange, high-pitched, stammering sound that vaguely resembled a chuckle, but carried absolutely no genuine humor. It sounded entirely foreign coming from his chest. He reached up and nervously adjusted his expensive silk tie, suddenly looking incredibly small inside his tailored suit. He looked at the printed press release resting on the table and then looked up at me with a terrifyingly fake smile stretching across his face. He actually clapped his hands together, a single sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. He leaned forward and called me his brilliant girl. The words slipped out of his mouth with an oily, desperate smoothness. He told me he always knew I had this incredible potential hidden deep inside me. He forced another booming laugh, attempting to project an image of proud paternal warmth. He actually tried to reframe his decades of emotional abuse and his horrific behavior tonight as a masterclass in parenting. He looked around the ruined Thanksgiving table and declared that his harshness was simply a test of my corporate fortitude. He told the room that a true chief executive officer needed to learn how to stand her ground against aggressive negotiations. He acted as though demanding I surrender my only home to a fraudulent hedge fund manager was just a sophisticated role-play exercise designed to sharpen my business instincts. The absolute delusion required to spin his cruelty into a badge of fatherly pride was staggering. Before the echo of Warren's forced laughter could even fade, my mother Brenda launched into an even more sickening display of sycophancy. She completely abandoned her role as the fierce protector of the golden child. She did not even glance down at Vanessa, who was still sitting right next to her, quietly sobbing into her hands, with her entire life falling apart. Brenda leaned entirely across the mahogany table, completely ignoring the shattered crystal water goblet and the dark red wine aggressively soaking into her pristine white linen tablecloth. She extended both of her hands toward me, her diamond bracelets clinking together. Her eyes were wide open, completely stripped of the disdain she had weaponized against me for my entire life. Instead, her eyes were filled with a frantic, terrifying mixture of absolute awe and cold, rapid calculation. She wanted to touch me. She was desperately reaching across the ruins of her perfect holiday dinner to physically connect herself to the $57 million. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers inch closer to my plate, remembering how that exact same hand had dismissively waved me away, just 20 minutes ago, when she mocked my career as a cute little computer hobby. Now her voice dripped with a sickeningly sweet artificial honey. She practically cooed at me, telling me how incredibly proud she was of my massive accomplishment. She claimed with breathtaking ease that she had always bragged about my tech company to her friends at the country club. She lied straight to my face, stating she had always known I was just a brilliant late bloomer taking my time to build an empire. Brenda actually tried to claim credit for my success. She looked at me with manufactured tears welling in her eyes and told me that her tough love was the exact reason I was sitting here a multimillionaire today. She claimed she had only ever pushed me away because she wanted to forge me into a strong, independent woman. She suddenly started showering me with aggressive, unearned compliments. She looked at the simple dark dress I was wearing and suddenly called it incredibly elegant and sophisticated. She complimented my posture. She complimented my intelligence. She was violently throwing the maternal validation I had spent my entire childhood desperately begging for right into my face. But it meant absolutely nothing to me now. It did not smell like love. It smelled like pure, unadulterated greed. The most disturbing part of the entire spectacle was the immediate absolute betrayal of Vanessa. As Warren and Brenda fell all over themselves attempting to worship at my altar, they completely discarded their golden child. Vanessa slowly lowered her hands from her face, her expensive makeup completely ruined by her tears. She sat frozen in her antique chair, watching her parents, the two people who had spent 3 decades placing her on an untouchable pedestal, instantly kick her into the dirt, the second a larger checkbook entered the room. For the very first time in her 33 years of life, Vanessa was completely invisible in her own family. Her parents did not care that her husband was a fraud or that she was about to lose her home. They only cared about securing their position next to the newly crowned billionaire in the room. I did not move my hands from my lap. I did not lean forward to meet my mother halfway. I let her hands hover awkwardly over the spilled wine until she finally realized I was not going to accept her touch. She slowly pulled her arms back, a brief flash of panic crossing her face before she forced her fake smile back into place. I looked at them with the cold clinical detachment of a scientist observing a highly predictable and deeply pathetic experiment. Their sudden, overwhelming affection was the greatest insult of the entire evening. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they had never disliked my personality, my choices, or my character. They only disliked my perceived lack of capital. They did not see Kira, their daughter, sitting at the table. They saw a limitless bank account. They saw a golden ticket to maintain their luxurious lifestyle without ever having to worry about the consequences of their actions. Warren cleared his throat again, adopting a tone of friendly business camaraderie. He completely ignored the terrified, hyperventilating man sitting to his right and focused entirely on my wealth. He started talking about the complexities of wealth management. He told me that $57 million was an overwhelming amount of capital for a young single woman to manage all by herself. He puffed out his chest and generously offered his services as an experienced corporate executive to help me navigate my new portfolio and protect my assets from greedy outsiders. He was already trying to position himself as the gatekeeper to my money, attempting to re-establish his control under the guise of paternal protection. The sheer lack of shame was a magnificent, horrifying spectacle. The family hierarchy had not just shifted, it had completely inverted, and they were violently scrambling to secure their spots at the bottom of my throne. Warren continued to enthusiastically detail his qualifications as a wealth manager, practically leaning over his empty dinner plate in his eagerness. He completely dismissed the fact that he had just spent the last hour treating me like a naive child. Now he spoke to me as a peer, a fellow corporate titan, who desperately needed his seasoned guidance to navigate the treacherous waters of high finance. He told me that with his connections and my capital, we could build a massive family trust that would secure our legacy for generations. He was completely blinded by the dollar signs, practically salivating over the thought of controlling my newly acquired wealth. He truly believed his sudden praise would immediately erase 35 years of neglect. As Warren rambled on about investment strategies and tax shelters, a sudden shift occurred across the table. Vanessa stopped crying. The loud theatrical sobbing that had filled the room just minutes before abruptly ceased. She lowered her hands from her ruined face, revealing eyes that were no longer filled with panic, but with a sharp, desperate calculation. She looked at the printed press release resting on the table, and then looked at Julian. The cogs in her mind were visibly turning, rapidly processing the implications of the $57 million. She realized that the solution to her impending homelessness was sitting right across from her. The sister she had spent her entire life tormenting was now the only person capable of saving her perfect life. Vanessa took a deep, shuddering breath and sat up straight, smoothing the wrinkled silk of her expensive dress. She wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks with the back of her hand and forced her face into an expression of earnest vulnerability. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, completely abandoning the venomous hatred she had hurled at me just moments ago. She reached across the table, mimicking our mother gesture, and tried to place her hand over mine. She told me she was so incredibly sorry for the things she had said. She claimed she had just been overwhelmed by the stress of Julian business troubles and had lashed out at the only person she knew would understand. The absolute audacity of her apology was breathtaking. She was attempting to reframe her lifelong cruelty as a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by stress. She did not wait for me to accept her apology before moving on to her true objective. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile and delivered the most entitled request I had ever heard in my life. She told me that since I had just made $57 million, the $3.2 million Julian owed was practically nothing to me. She suggested with absolute sincerity that I should simply forgive the debt. She framed it not as a massive financial sacrifice on my part, but as a simple act of family unity. She told me that I had more than enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and that it would be incredibly selfish of me to let her lose her home and her cars when I had the power to stop it with a single stroke of a pen. My mother Brenda immediately chimed in, her voice vibrating with eager agreement. She completely supported Vanessa, logic acting as though demanding a $3 million gift was a perfectly reasonable request to make of a daughter she had just tried to throw out of the house. Brenda told me that family always protects family. She reminded me of the horrible public embarrassment it would cause if Julian firm was liquidated and they were forced to declare bankruptcy. She told me that people at the country club would talk, and the family reputation would be permanently ruined. She practically demanded that I write off the debt to save them from social humiliation. She argued that since I was now incredibly wealthy, I had a moral obligation to elevate my sister and ensure she maintained the lifestyle she was accustomed to. Warren nodded his head firmly, his sudden role as my financial advisor already going to his head. He looked at me with a serious, authoritative expression and told me that forgiving the debt was the smartest move for the family portfolio. He claimed it would be a clean write-off and that it was a small price to pay to keep the family intact and avoid a messy public scandal. He even suggested that once I cleared Julian debt, I could provide him with a fresh injection of capital to help him restart his firm on solid ground. He was actually asking me to fund the man who had just tried to steal my house. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from the three of them was magnificent. They truly believed that because we shared the same blood, my massive success existed solely to subsidize their massive failures. Julian finally lifted his head, his face pale and covered in a sheen of nervous sweat. He looked at me with a pathetic glimmer of hope in his eyes. He actually believed them. He believed that the pressure from my parents and the tearful apology from Vanessa would be enough to break me. He thought the old dynamic was still in play where, if they just pushed hard enough and demanded loud enough, I would eventually fold and give them whatever they wanted. He forced a weak, apologetic smile and told me he was ready to sit down and discuss a restructuring plan whenever I was ready. He was already trying to dictate the terms of his own salvation, assuming my compliance was guaranteed. I looked at the four of them, taking in the absolute absurdity of the situation. The golden child was begging for a $3 million handout. The brilliant fund manager was hoping to be bailed out by the woman he had tried to swindle. The authoritative parents were demanding I sacrifice my wealth to protect their social standing. They were a perfect united front of toxic greed and unbreakable delusion. They had spent the entire evening demanding I hand over my modest bungalow, and now they were demanding I hand over $3 million. The price tag had changed, but the fundamental disrespect remained exactly the same. They did not view me as a person. They viewed me as a resource to be exploited whenever they found themselves in trouble. I let their demands hang in the air, letting the absolute silence amplify the sheer audacity of their request before I prepared to give them my final answer. I slowly pulled my hand back, leaving my mother grasping at empty air over the ruined tablecloth. I did not do it aggressively, but the deliberate coldness of the movement was enough to make Brenda flinch. I looked around the table, making eye contact with each of them, taking in their expectant, greedy faces. I told them no. It was a single, quiet syllable, but it struck the room with the force of a physical blow. I explained that I was not going to forgive a single penny of the debt, and I was certainly not going to fund a new venture for a man who had spent the entire evening attempting to rob me. The collective gasp from my parents was immediate. Warren's face darkened, returning to a shade of furious red, while Brenda pressed her hand to her chest in absolute shock. They simply could not fathom that their sudden influx of flattery had failed to purchase my obedience. I decided it was time to dismantle their delusions completely. I told my parents that their sudden affection was the most insulting thing I had ever experienced. I pointed directly at Warren and reminded him that just 20 minutes ago he had threatened to physically throw me out of his house and disown me. I looked at Brenda and reminded her that she had mocked my career and blamed my single status on my supposed toxic bitterness. I kept my voice perfectly even, ensuring every word cut through the air with surgical precision. I told them that they did not love me, and they certainly did not respect me. I explained that for 35 years I had been the designated scapegoat of this family. I reminded them of the high school graduation they skipped because Vanessa had a minor cheerleading competition. I brought up the countless holidays where I was seated near the kitchen and spoken to only when they needed someone to run errands or serve drinks. I told them that I had spent my entire life starving for their basic approval, working myself to the bone, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same pride they reserved exclusively for Vanessa. But watching them completely discard their golden child the second they realized I had $57 million cured me of that desire forever. I explained that their loyalty was not tied to blood or family values, but entirely dictated by whoever held the largest bank account. I stated clearly that my wealth was not a family asset. It was not a portfolio for Warren to manage, and it was not a social tool for Brenda to brag about at her country club. The money belonged entirely to me, built on the years of isolation and relentless work they had so casually dismissed as a cute little computer hobby. Warren opened his mouth to argue to try and reassert his patriarchal dominance, but I held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. I turned my full attention back to Julian, who was trembling so violently, His antique chair was actually vibrating against the hardwood floor. I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away the final shreds of his false hope. I told him that I did not buy his debt to save him. I bought his debt because I knew exactly how reckless and incompetent he was, and I wanted to be the one holding the gavel when his fraudulent empire finally collapsed. I informed him that there would be no restructuring plan, no bridge loans, and absolutely no family discount. I delivered my final verdict with absolute clinical detachment. I told Julian that I would be instructing my legal team to initiate the aggressive asset seizure process at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. I promised him that my firm would liquidate every failing property, freeze every hidden account, and repossess every leased luxury vehicle he had used to maintain his pathetic facade. Julian let out a hollow, ragged sob, completely burying his face in his hands. He was a broken man, mourning the death of his own ego. The reality of Monday morning was inescapable. Upon hearing the finality of my decision, Vanessa completely lost whatever fragile grip she had left on her sanity. She leaped out of her chair, her silk dress knocking over her crystal wine glass. She ignored her weeping husband entirely and directed all of her frantic terror toward me. She started screaming that I was a monster. She sobbed hysterically, claiming that without the money to pay off the bank, she and Julian would be thrown out onto the street. She wailed about losing her gated community, her country club status, and her entire social circle. She was weeping for her material possessions without shedding a single tear for the destruction of her husband. In her blind panic, Vanessa pivoted back to her original objective. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at the manila envelope still sitting completely untouched on my dinner plate. She begged me through heavy, gasping sobs to at least sign the quitclaim deed. She reasoned that if I was too incredibly selfish to pay off their $3 million debt, I could at least give them our grandmother house so they could sell it and secure a cheap apartment. She tried to weaponize guilt, claiming that Grandma Josephine would be disgusted to see me hoarding wealth, while my own sister faced homelessness. She demanded that I hand over the deed immediately, framing it as my absolute last chance to prove I actually cared about the family. I looked at the manila envelope and then looked up at my sister sobbing pathetic tears over a piece of paper that was entirely useless. I let a genuine smile touch my lips for the first time all evening. I decided to reveal my final secret, the one detail that would completely destroy her lifelong narrative of superiority. I told Vanessa that her fake tears were a waste of energy because she was begging for a prize that did not even exist. I calmly informed her that even if I wanted to sign the quitclaim deed right now, the transfer of property would be completely rejected by the city courts. Vanessa stopped screaming, her chest heaving, as she stared at me in total confusion. I explained that Grandma Josephine was far more observant than anyone in this family ever realized. She saw right through the expensive country club facade my parents maintained. She knew exactly how greedy and entitled Vanessa was, and she knew Julian was nothing but a hollow man in a flashy suit. 3 years before she passed away, Grandma Josephine secretly met with a team of estate lawyers. She did not just leave the house to me in a standard will, which she knew my parents would aggressively contest. Instead, she placed the physical deed into an ironclad, irrevocable, living trust. I watched the color completely drain from Vanessa's face as I explained the legal reality of that trust. I told her that I was named the sole trustee and the exclusive beneficiary. The legal parameters of the trust explicitly forbade the property from being used as collateral for any commercial loans and completely shielded it from being transferred to any other family member under any circumstances. I explained that the trust was designed specifically to protect my inheritance from her exact brand of parasitic greed. I looked at the manila envelope Julian had so confidently presented and called it nothing more than a piece of expensive garbage. I told Vanessa that she never had a legal claim to the house in the first place, and her entire plan to steal my sanctuary was dead years before she even brought it to the Thanksgiving table. The realization that she had been completely outmaneuvered not just by me, but by the grandmother she had always ignored was the final crushing blow. Vanessa's knees simply gave out. She collapsed back into her chair, staring blankly at the ruined Thanksgiving feast, completely paralyzed by the totality of her defeat. My parents sat in stunned silence, unable to process the brilliant legal foresight of a woman they had always considered simple and old-fashioned. They had walked into the dining room believing they held all the power, ready to strip me of everything I loved. Now they were sitting in the wreckage of their own arrogance, completely at my mercy, and acutely aware that I had absolutely none left to give. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating, but for the very first time in my life, it did not belong to me. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table and slowly pushed my heavy antique chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the polished hardwood floor, cutting sharply through the quiet, pathetic sobbing of my sister and the panicked, ragged breathing of my brother-in-law. I stood up perfectly straight, taking my time. I smoothed the wrinkles from my dark dress, running my hands down the expensive fabric with deliberate care. I looked down at the 4 people sitting around the ruined Thanksgiving feast. They looked incredibly small. The terrifying giants of my childhood, the harsh, uncompromising critics who had dictated my self-worth for 35 years, were completely gone. In their place sat 4 broken strangers drowning in a massive, catastrophic mess of their own creation. My mother. Brenda looked up at me as I adjusted my structured leather tote bag on my shoulder. She reached her manicured hand out one final time, her diamond bracelets clinking together as her fingers trembled in the empty air. She whispered my name, her voice cracking with a pathetic, desperate hope. She pleaded with me to sit back down to talk about this situation as a family and to find a reasonable solution together. Warren chimed in right after her, his booming executive voice reduced to a frantic, raspy whisper. He told me I could not just walk away and leave them in this state. He reminded me that it was a holiday, that we were supposed to be united, and that family must always stick together during hard times. The sheer hypocrisy of his words was absolutely astounding. Just an hour ago, he had commanded me to pack my bags, sign away my inheritance, and vacate his property. Now he was begging me to stay, utterly terrified of what would happen the exact moment I walked out that front door. I felt absolutely no anger. The burning resentment that had fueled my long, sleepless nights of building my company, the bitter, agonizing sting of their constant rejection, it was all completely gone. I looked at their tear-stained, panicked faces and felt a profound, absolute detachment. It felt exactly like watching a tragic play from the highest balcony seats in a theater. I was no longer an actor on their miserable stage. I did not owe them an explanation. I did not owe them an apology. And I certainly did not owe them my financial salvation. I looked at Julian, who was staring blankly at the dark red wine aggressively soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. His entire fraudulent corporate empire was collapsing all around him, and he knew there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop the impending ruin. I looked at Vanessa, whose eyes were wide and vacant, her mind completely broken by the terrifying realization that the grandmother she always ignored had outsmarted her entirely from the grave. I opened my leather tote bag and reached inside the small zippered side pocket. I bypassed my phone and my keys, pulling out my slim leather wallet. I unzipped the main compartment and extracted a single crisp $100 bill. I held it gently between my index and middle fingers, letting the bright green paper catch the warm light from the crystal chandelier overhead. I looked directly at my mother, locking eyes with her one last time. I told her that the Thanksgiving dinner she prepared was beautiful, and I thanked her politely for her hospitality. My voice was perfectly even, entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria she was always so accustomed to dealing with. I extended my hand over the center of the dining table. I positioned my fingers directly above the disastrous pile of legal paperwork. Directly below my hand sat the worthless rubber $10,000 check from Julian, the terrifying formal notice of default from the commercial bank, and the glossy press release announcing my $57 million corporate acquisition. It was a flawless visual representation of the entire evening. I let go of the $100 bill. It fluttered down softly, landing right on top of the spilled sweet cranberry sauce and the shattered shards of the crystal water goblet. I told Brenda that I was leaving the money to cover the dry cleaning bill for the linen tablecloth. I noted that I had spilled a few drops of water from my glass earlier, and I wanted to make absolutely sure I did not leave a mess behind for her to clean up. The absolute coldness of the gesture, the supreme finality of tossing a $100 bill onto a table where millions had just been fiercely debated, was the ultimate symbol of my complete independence. They cared so deeply about money and social appearances, so I gave them exactly what they valued most. I closed my purse securely and turned my back on the dining table, leaving them completely alone with the brutal reality of their choices. I walked out of the formal dining room and stepped into the long main hallway of the house I grew up in. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the dining area immediately began to fade away, replaced by the familiar, comforting scent of lemon furniture polish and vanilla candles. I walked slowly, my heels clicking with a steady, rhythmic cadence against the polished hardwood floor. As I passed the grand living room, I looked at the tall walls lined with expensive framed family photographs. For years, walking down this specific hallway had been a deeply painful reminder of my intense isolation. I saw picture after picture of Vanessa, smiling brightly, holding golden trophies, wearing expensive prom dresses, and posing with our parents on lavish tropical vacations. I was either completely absent from the photos or pushed to the far outer edges, a blurry, insignificant afterthought in their perfect family portrait. Tonight, looking at those exact same pictures, I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of relief. I realized that being excluded from their picture-perfect narrative was actually the greatest gift they could have ever given me. Their harsh rejection forced me to build my own world, my own resilience, and my own massive empire. If they had accepted me, if they had nurtured me and made me comfortable, I might have ended up exactly like Vanessa, a fragile dependent shell, terrified of losing her borrowed wealthy status. Every single step I took toward the front door felt like shedding a physical weight. The toxic history, the constant belittling, the desperate, pathetic craving for parental validation, it all fell off my shoulders and dissolved right into the floorboards. I was leaving the scared 35-year-old freelancer behind and walking out as the unquestioned architect of my own destiny. I reached the massive oak front door and grasped the cool brass handle. I turned it firmly and pulled the heavy door open, stepping out onto the wide front porch. The blast of crisp autumn air hit my face instantly, clearing the lingering, suffocating smell of roasted turkey and spilled bourbon from my senses. The night was beautifully clear, the dark sky dotted with bright, cold stars. The manicured green lawn of my parents' estate looked peaceful and quiet, in the pale moonlight standing in stark contrast to the absolute devastation currently unfolding inside those brick walls. I took a deep cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the freezing air, feeling more alive and more powerful than I ever had before. A sleek black town car was idling quietly at the end of the long driveway, its bright headlights cutting through the autumn darkness. My driver saw me step onto the porch and immediately exited the vehicle, walking around to open the rear passenger door. He stood respectfully waiting for me to approach. I walked down the brick pathway, feeling the cold wind whip the hem of my dark dress around my legs. I did not rush. I took my time, enjoying the absolute perfect silence of the affluent suburban neighborhood. I reached the car and paused, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the open door. I turned my head and looked back at the house one last time. The large bay window of the dining room was glowing brightly with warm golden light. Through the sheer white curtains, I could see the blurry silhouettes of my family. They were no longer sitting perfectly upright in their antique chairs, projecting wealth and superiority. They were huddled together, a chaotic, desperate mess of frantic movement and profound despair. I knew exactly what was happening in that room. Julian was panicking about his impending public bankruptcy. Vanessa was sobbing over her lost inheritance and her shattered social standing. Warren and Brenda were frantically trying to figure out how to salvage their pristine reputation while mourning the permanent loss of the massive wealth that had just walked out their front door. They were choking on the bitter ashes of their own arrogance, suffocating under the crushing weight of the lies they had spent a lifetime protecting. I smiled a genuine, peaceful smile. I slid into the luxurious leather-back seat of the town car, and the driver closed the door with a solid, comforting thud. The powerful engine hummed softly as we pulled away from the curb, leaving the pristine neighborhood and the toxic history entirely behind me. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the streetlights blur past in the night. I was heading back to my own home, my grandmother's sanctuary, entirely free and completely victorious. I would love to read your stories in the comments section below about a time you had to walk away from toxic family members who refused to see your true worth. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience and reclaiming your absolute power. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that sometimes the greatest revenge is simply walking away and building a beautiful, successful life completely on your own terms. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and remember that your value is never determined by the people who are too blind to appreciate it.